and send it to the radio chat, and then we go into professional mode from there, inshallah. Yeah, sound good?
Inshallah. Yeah, of course.
Okay. Abu Sarwar, we'll take turns sort of asking questions, if that's okay.
Yeah. You do the lead. I'll pop in when
Khair. Okay.
I've got something, inshallah.
Okay. Bismillah. Let me just copy the link. Just give me 1 second. Bismillah. Okay. Just give me 5 seconds. Yeah. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. Assalamu alaikum, those who are watching, listening in. Today, we aren't with our usual co-host Muzakkir, but we're with Imam Abu Sarwar, alhamdulillah. What a blessing to have Abu Sarwar as a co-host.
Sure.
And along with Imam Abu Sarwar, our special guest of the day, Ustadh Niyaz Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum, Niyaz.
Wa
How are
alaikum
you?
assalam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, I'm well. Again,
Alhamdulillah.
special is an exaggeration, inshallah, but alhamdulillah.
Inshallah. ما في مشكلة. There's no problem in we're not doing exaggeration. We're giving you your due right. Abu Sarwar, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, by
Alhamdulillah.
the grace of Allah, can't complain.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Before we get straight uh into history and politics and all of these juicy topics, let's start off with how Ramadan's going. Obviously, I discussed this extensively in the first radio episode, so I don't want to bore anyone. But let's start off with Abu Sarwar. How's your Ramadan going so far? What
Alhamdulillah.
sort of adjustments have you had to make from last year compared to this year?
So first and foremost, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Um, Look, as always, Ramadan is a time for reflection. It's a time for renewal of your iman, renewal of your relationship with the Quran, making the Quran your companion. And I think that's probably the biggest sort of point that I've had in terms of improvement, shall I say. As always, we always read the Quran and we're always praying Salah and everything else. But this Ramadan, the difference for me has been, Alhamdulillah, this year I've been leading Taraweeh. Not Khatam,
Allah.
so don't have the same honor as yourselves, but nonetheless, still leading Taraweeh. With from Juz Amma, with Juz Tabarak, and some of the shorter sort of passages within the local community. And I think the adjustment has been in terms of preparation for it and kind of getting a taste, I would say, for how the Hufaz feel to some extent in terms of preparation and in terms of the effort that goes into it. I felt a little bit burnt out after 3 days, let alone imagine the Hafaz doing the whole 30 days, and I'm having to do the whole 30 days. But Alhamdulillah, this has been a blessing for me because it's also been an eye opener where I've been like, you know what, I want to develop further in my journey of the memorization of the Quran. So I see this as a blessing for myself. Um,
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
so Alhamdulillah, I would say this has been the biggest sort of change and difference for me in the month of Ramadan.
Alhamdulillah. That sounds lovely. How's your first on that topic? Usually, I mean, me personally, I felt this as well. But a lot of Huffaz, they have stage fright their first time leading Taraweeh. I think it might be a bit different for you because you're a bit older. You've led Salah many a time before. But did you feel that, or did it just feel
You
like you
feel
were
you
leading a
feel
normal
you feel
Salah?
it always. You feel it always. The honest truth is you
Yeah,
feel it always. I'm leading Jum'ah every week. Even when I lead Fajr Maghrib, the moment that walk up to the Musalla, up to the prayer mat, that's the moment that you start feeling, oh, all eyes are on you. But
yeah,
again, like I say,
definitely.
once you're in your sort of flow, and
Yeah,
this is why understanding the Quran and appreciating the Quran is very important, because when you start understanding what you're reciting, you're developing that relationship with it. So you start getting into the flow of it a lot better. And as I'm sure you'll know as well,
yeah,
it helps with controlling those nerves and and all those other things that sort of come with it.
Yeah, 100%. I'd agree with that completely. I think anyone who's led Salah and they have some familiarity with the meaning of the Quran, they'd agree with you in that sense. Especially when, for example, today, I mean, I don't want to waste too much of time when we've got our historian on, but I'll just quickly mention this point. Today we've got Surah Yusuf, and I think pretty much everyone's familiar with the story of Yusuf. And you can't focus on anything else other than the story of Yusuf when you're reciting from Surah Yusuf, if that makes sense. You can't think about, perhaps in Asr you might be thinking of your dunyawi thoughts, what you're gonna have for iftar. I mean, you can tell how hungry I am, but if that's the first thing that comes to mind, what you're gonna do tomorrow, what you need to do when you're reciting a surah of such power, like Surah Yusuf, or I don't know, Surah Qasas, which talks about the story of Musa alayhi salam, or a passage of Quran that discusses the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, you're forced, like you're pushed into a corner, and your only choice is to completely immerse yourself in the ayat of Allah. So to be honest, it's good hearing a perspective from someone whose first time leading Taraweeh isn't their first time leading Salah, nor are they, unfamiliar with the meanings of the Quran and whatnot. It's quite a unique perspective. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khairan for sharing that. Ustadh Niyaz, what about yourself? Before we task you with discussing all these difficult topics of history, liberalism, politics, what sort of experience have you had with Ramadan? 10 days in.
So my Ramadan, alhamdulillah, has been very, very eye-opening. Comparing my situation last year, where alhamdulillah, as a school teacher,
Yeah,
last year the Easter holidays fell into the last 10 nights of Ramadan.
yeah,
So I remember last year telling myself that, alhamdulillah, it gives me so much time to recite Quran, to engage in worship, engage in all the different things that I wouldn't be able to in a normal school day. But
yeah.
what I've realized is when I look back at what I did last year in those last 10 days, I look back at my first 10 days this Ramadan, I realized that I've actually done a lot more this Ramadan. And
Yeah,
I think this is something that's that really hit me, is that for certain people, I guess, when there is routine in their life, when there's routine, you get a lot more done, because
100%. Yeah,
unfortunately you get lazy, isn't it, when you know that you got the whole day free and you can
yeah,
wake up as late as you like.
yeah, exactly. 100%. That's a very good observation.
Um,
So, yeah, you were saying?
Yeah, and I was just saying that alhamdulillah, this first couple of days, alhamdulillah, has really, really been beneficial, especially to be able to spend time with my family, work, and be able to engage, in all the worship that I wanted to involve myself in. And alhamdulillah, there is such blessing when you do things for the sake of Allah, and there's so much barakah in your time. And I think that's my main observation that's happened this Ramadan.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, to be honest. And you never sort of realize this sort of agenda that
Mm,
the busier you get, the more time you get.
mm,
You have a structured routine, and you have to fit in things in certain times where you wouldn't do anything if you were free. But I think Ramadan's been the perfect time for everyone because this
mm,
feels like the first Ramadan where no one's been free, especially these first 10 days and last 10 days as well. I mean, people tend to take time off, but compared to the last few Ramadans where you'd have the April holidays or you'd have the May holidays or even the summer holidays around 10 or so years ago, this Ramadan's probably one of the first Ramadans where you don't have time after work either. You come home from work and it's time for iftar straight away. So alhamdulillah, that's a very good observation. Now, let's talk about what we brought you here for, Ustad. So of course, I mean, I've given you a rough introduction, but let's discuss your studies first in terms of history and politics.
yeah,
So I know you studied undergraduate in history at Queen Mary,
yeah.
and since you've been teaching um, GCSE and A-level history and politics to some extent at secondary school, uh, what exactly did you study during your
So
undergraduate?
so alhamdulillah, we were able to study a variety of different things. Again, from the Western academic schools of thought. And alhamdulillah, at Queen Mary, there was a very large Islamic world community. So one of the reasons why I chose that particular university is because they placed a big emphasis on Islamic history, in the history of, from, for example, from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to, for example, the Ottoman times. We had, accomplished historians in the Crusades, for example, and other aspects of Islamic history as well. And there was a very, very strong Arabic department as well in Queen Mary that the School of History would collaborate with. And when I was engaging with them, I found out something very, very enticing. and played a big
Yeah,
part in obviously pushing for my Arabic studies when I joined Q-Iman as soon as I graduated. So a variety of topics alongside European history as well, which gives you a
yeah,
really good perspective of different lifestyles and different civilizations. But there are lessons in the history of all civilizations.
100%. Yeah. And to be honest, as someone who, I mean, this is me guessing, but of course, go as someone who grew up in a heavy Muslim Bengali area, like you're very much into that sort of community. You're right in the center,
Mm.
attending class at ELM and Darul Ummah and whatnot. I assume you went into the degree with the intention of focusing on Islamic history. Was that the same on your way out when you graduated? Did you feel more of an appreciation for, I don't know, Western history, European history, pre-Islamic history, or did your interest in Islamic history further strengthen?
My interest in Islamic history further strengthened most definitely because of course I was coming into a very Western academic perspective, some of which opinions will shock a lot of people, and from the Islamic mainstream scholarship would never accept things as far fetched as that was did Makkah even exist?
Yeah,
Big debates like this, which of course have been debunked, but yet are still discussed a lot in Western academic circles. And they take a very revisionist approach, which basically means they want to relook at the last 1400 years of Islamic scholarship and re-question everything that we have studied, everything we have written. So coming from that, Alhamdulillah, I was able to have mentors and teachers, Islamic teachers that were able to keep me grounded and firm on my faith. Anytime I had a doubt, okay, oh, they're teaching me this in university, I could always go to my mentor and ask him, look, what's this situation? And able to give me an explanation from an Islamic perspective. And I think
yeah,
that's something that really, really helped. And when I left university, it only strengthened my desire to go study under more teachers, to go study under, and especially go study the Arabic language, so I could access all the resources that I could not access at university because everything's in English there, isn't it?
yeah. Especially, I mean, studying in the West and whatnot, studying Islamic history. I mean, you must have felt like, as much as there are recorded details of perhaps the Ottomans or the Mamluks or whatnot, there's a whole other world that you can't unlock unless you have access to the Arabic books that are untranslated and whatnot. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know if how true that is. You would know better,
Mm.
but I'm sure that's how it felt like.
Yeah, it definitely did feel like that. Quite interestingly, most pertinent moments were when I was discussing with my non-Muslim peers. When, for example, in I remember this incident very, very clearly when we were studying a unit on women and Islam, women in medieval Islam, and
Yeah,
again from a very feminist perspective, in aspects like our main core readings were from people like Amina Wadud,
yeah,
and others. And I remember this interaction. We were talking about the Prophet ﷺ's marriages, and
sallallahu alaihi
one of
wasallam.
ﷺ's marriages, and one of the female classmates opened up and said, "Oh, is it only? I think I've always understood the marriages as him only liking virgins." Now, right? This is
Na'udhu
how she's
billah.
describing the Prophet ﷺ, that
Was she,
she
out of curiosity, was she a Muslim or?
she was not Muslim. She was not Muslim.
Ya
So
salam.
we were studying the marriage of Aisha, and
Yeah,
she's like, oh, that means she only likes virgins. And
yeah,
I had to then butt in and say, well, hold on, Khadija radiallahu anha was not a virgin, right?
yeah.
And he,
Majority of his wives. Sallallahu
majority
alaihi
was
wasallam.
exactly. So again, is and I didn't really blame her in that instance because that is the mentality and that is the environment that she grew up in the
Yeah,
limited
yeah,
knowledge that she has of Islam. And this was a common occurrence where, uh, you know, a lot of non-Muslims and even some Muslims, I had to remind them of the basics.
yeah.
And that's unfortunate how it is in these Western academic circles. But alhamdulillah, if you have good teachers and good mentors around you that can keep you firm on uh, that foundational basis, alhamdulillah, you'll be able to succeed and really take from it what is good and leave what is bad.
100%. That's a very interesting observation. I'm sure that's probably the first time. I mean, I don't know how your school days were, but that's probably the first time you came across just the general
Mm.
Western understanding of Islam outside
Mm.
of Islamic circles.
Yeah.
And I mean, no better place than someone who's studying history but with an Islamic perspective
Mm.
to encounter these perspectives so that you can, sort of adapt and navigate eventually through these issues and whatnot. Alhamdulillah. Now, I do understand you wrote a 10,000 word dissertation at the end of your degree. And
Yeah,
obviously, because you've mentioned you went in with a strong Islamic perspective, I'm
yeah.
interested to know what specific topic did you write this on? And what was the general topic of the dissertation?
So I wrote I decided to do my dissertation particularly focusing on Ottoman history, particularly focusing on the opening of Constantinople in 1453,
Yeah,
essentially ending a centuries old empire, the Roman Empire. And we call it the Byzantine Empire, but it is actually the Roman Empire of the great Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesars. The Caesars that we learned all the way back in primary school and secondary school.
yeah.
The real Empire was ended in 1453, not so much in 476 as many other people might assume.
Yeah,
In 1453, Muhammad al-Fatih, or Mehmed II, in Western
rahimahullah.
discourse, rahimahullah, um, decides to plan out and really, fulfill one of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ of
Sallallahu alayhi
whoever,
wa sallam.
what a great man, the conqueror of Constantinople, what a great army that
Yeah,
that army would be. And he really envisioned that from a very beginning, even as young as 12 years old, when he was made sultan by his father at 12 years old.
wow.
And he was made sultan for about 2 years until there was a rebellion in which his father then came back to try and solve. And it was only until his father passed away that he was able to then really relive that dream and make it
Yeah,
one of his main components. And remember, it wasn't only just about expanding this large empire or large state. For the focus of my essay was that the conquest of not just Muhammad al-Fatih, but the conquest of all the previous Ottoman rulers that came before him were not so much an act of conquest, but an
yeah,
opening of faith. That was the thesis that I was working on. That the Ottoman expansion of lands primarily was built around building Darul Islam,
yeah,
building that notion of Islam from the ruins that it had emerged from the destruction that the Mongol Empire had imperiled on our ummah in the
yeah,
early 1200s. But we know what the Mongols did. They destroyed Baghdad, not only Baghdad, but so many different centers of learning. Samarkand, Uzbek, current day Central Asia, was destroyed. Libraries that maybe Imam Bukhari would have studied in, all destroyed by the Mongols. And from the ashes of the Mongols came the Ottomans, who were able to revive Islam and revive that Islamic spirit amongst our ummah. And I really focus on that particular spirit in my dissertation, and really try to push the idea that whilst of course expansion and conquest was all important factors, it was faith that was the driving factor.
yeah. And to be honest, I think the main force pushing out the narrative on Sultan Mahmud Al Fatih's conquest has been Western Orientalist
Mm,
forces. And I remember me and you had a conversation on this, to be honest. I
yeah.
was asking you about this. There was a documentary released, or rather a docu-series released
Mm,
on this conquest, and they just gloss over the aspect of faith that you
yeah.
wrote about and that you mentioned. For them, it was just he was a bloodthirsty, barbarian. He just wanted to conquer. He just wanted to expand the Turkish Empire. When in fact, it was obviously there was an Islamic motive, and I think you could shed more light on this. From what I've heard and from what I've come across, Sultan Mehmed Al Fatih was an erudite scholar, and so
Mm,
were the Ottoman, so were those of the Sultanate after him. They were
mm,
trained to be Shuyukh al-Islam. Even though
mm,
there was a position of Shaykh al-Islam, the Pasha,
mm.
uh, at the time, which was independent from the Sultan. How was how intergrained with scholarship was the Sultanate?
Yeah, so the Ottomans and their relationship with the scholars in the early Ottoman period. So this is Muhammad al-Fatih and his
Yeah.
ancestors were
On
in
that
his
note,
path.
by the
Yeah.
way, what's the sort of yardstick? Do we say the early Ottoman period is Uthman and whatnot, or do we just
Yeah.
kickstart things with Sultan Mehmed?
No, we kickstart things with Osman the
Yeah, yeah,
First, because essentially we call the early Ottoman period up until probably up into Suleiman the Magnificent, as they call him in the West, or
yeah.
Suleiman the First. This is considered the peak of Ottoman expansion and the peak of Ottoman power. For
Okay.
by the 1500s, nothing happened in the world without the Ottomans knowing about it, right?
Yeah,
And this concept of empire really started when Muhammad al-Fatih comes into power, but the concept of a state really starts with Osman. And particularly, I would argue, me personally, that it didn't really start with Osman. and it really started with his son Orhan.
Yeah.
And the reason why a lot of people start with Osman and why majority scholarship sticks with Osman is in essence the the takeover of the city of Bursa in Turkey,
Yeah.
and his emphasis on, and this is the part that we focus on, is that his emphasis on working with the scholars and particularly the Sufi orders of the time.
Yeah.
There is a figure in Ottoman history called Sheikh Edibali that was considered Osman's mentor. Osman's
Yeah.
mentor, and he was seen as this religious spiritual figure that would motivate Osman spiritually to then build his Islamic nature in order to then expand Islamic lands. And every single Ottoman Sultan that came after him would have a similar figure like Sheikh Adibali that Osman had. Orhan would have his sheikh. His sons would then have their sheikh, and they would have their sheikh, and they would have very very close ties with a particular group called the Ahi Brotherhood. The Ahi
Yeah.
Brotherhood were essentially what we might call today warrior sheikhs. You know,
Okay. MashaAllah. Yeah.
mashallah, masters of the pen, but also masters of the
Like
sword.
Lisan al-Ghaib from Gene 2.
Of course,
MashaAllah.
yes.
So,
You love the pop culture references,
of
mashallah.
course, of course. For our viewers' sake, astaghfirullah. May Allah forgive us for watching films prior to Ramadan.
Can I ask you how many times you've watched Dune 2?
Allah, we shouldn't expose ourselves. I watched it twice in cinema, and I watched it twice at home.
Oh, mashallah.
I'm still yet to watch it a fifth time, and I'm planning to watch it.
Our
But
Hafiz went
may
to a
Allah save me.
cinema.
What did you say?
Our Hafiz went to a cinema.
No, 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 no.
No,
That was a
no, no,
slip of the tongue.
no. It was a home cinema, wasn't it? That's
Yeah,
what it
yeah,
was.
yeah. Home
Yeah,
cinema, home cinema. There's
home
Nasheed in the
cinema.
background.
Yeah.
Sayyidul Hassan Hasnuddin and
There was Nasheed in the background, and the characters were mutahajjibin. They were mutahajjibat. It's fine. Yeah, sorry, you were saying about the warrior scholar you were talking about,
Yeah,
yes.
so they would have strong ties with the Ottoman government, with the Ottoman state. Bear in mind the first beginnings of that, Osman Orhan, there wasn't really a structured state. It was only until Murad the First that you started to have actual structures being put into place, and essentially a triangle was created where you had the Ottoman Sultan on the top, and then you had
Yeah,
the ulama, the scholarship, and then you had the military, right? All holding each other accountable.
yeah,
So the scholarships would hold the army and the sultan accountable. The sultan would hold the ulama and the army accountable. The army would hold the ulama and the sultan accountable. So again,
okay,
there was that three-way checks and balances, much like we have today in modern democracy, but very very
yeah,
different in the way that they used to rule. And they used and the scholars played a big part in the expansion of Muslim lands, because as they were going and conquering Christian lands, it wasn't the people of Bosnia, Bulgaria, Hungary were not accepting Islam by the hands of the sword. They were accepting Islam at the hands of the scholars. So
yeah,
you had many da'is going into these areas and spreading Islam, through words, not through
yeah,
force.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. That's very profound. And to be honest, that's a sharp rebuttal because whenever the Orientalists and Western academia discuss this sort of era you've mentioned, up until Suleiman the Magnificent, it's always Islam was spread at the sword. Even outside of the Ottoman Empire with the
Mm,
Abbasids and Mamluks, which inshallah
mm,
we'll get to shortly, inshallah. They always mention Islam was spread at the sword, but it's interesting you mentioned that that's not the case. In fact, there was an intricate political system. On
mm,
that note, obviously you are someone who teaches A-level politics.
mm,
What sort of political system today would be most akin to the Ottoman system? Because you mentioned the scholars would hold the rulers
mm,
accountable, the rulers would hold the scholars accountable. And I just thought to myself about perhaps the modern Muslim countries where, though that in essence is meant to take place, what happens is the scholars are feeding into the rulers. Though they're for example, in the UAE,
mm,
with, I don't want to mention any names, with
mm,
the Mauritanian scholar,
mm,
and in Saudi with the Saudi scholars,
mm,
though their position is, and it might have been performed in the past,
mm,
but their position is to essentially correct the rulers. And this
mm,
did happen in the past,
mm,
especially with certain groups which you wouldn't expect it from. It did happen in the past.
mm,
But now it seems to, the ruler says something, the fatwa was issued in favor of the ruler. The ruler changed his mind, new fatwa drops in favor of the ruler. So I just wanted to know your take and your perspective on the similarity, or rather the stark difference between our modern Islamic political system
Yeah.
and what the Ottomans had, and what made the
Yeah.
Ottomans so successful.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a lot to unpack there. But first of all, in order to understand the modern system of politics that we have today, how global politics work, we need to understand that the last 100 years, or particularly since the beginning of the 20th century and the end of World War One, before
Yeah,
World War One, we had the age of empires. We had open borders. But then after World War One, we had really the concept of the nation state solidifying. This concept that we have closed borders, the characteristics of a state where it has central government, where it has a permanent population, where it has a standing army. These sort of concepts did not really exist before World War One and during the Ottoman times.
yeah,
So when comparing the political systems of the past to today, we've got to really look at it from a historical lens in the way that we must also look at it from a political lens. And the question you were asking, how do we compare today to the Ottoman times, for example? Well, I would say, for example, that this is something that we spoke about. I remember in our class, in our other lesson with Sheikh Buta, is that can we really call any countries today Islamic?
yeah.
Right?
He did
Oh,
mention that
yeah.
last
And
lesson.
can we call should we rather just call them Muslim countries, right? Because
Yeah,
this claim that the scholars, I don't like using this term because I feel that it is the disrespect to the knowledge and scholars that
yeah.
but
I'll just give a preface on that
yeah,
point. To be honest,
yeah,
though my comment or my
yeah,
question might have sounded
yeah,
aimed from a certain perspective,
yeah.
I obviously not mean no disrespect to any
Of
scholars. We
course,
love and respect them all
yeah,
for
of
their
course,
endeavors in the deen. And as you were
of
saying,
course, of course. And the main thing is that since the time of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, we you know we have had instances where scholars have obviously worked with the rulers to issue certain fatwas for political reasons, right?
yeah,
So this is nothing new. But we have instances of scholars working with the rulers. This is nothing new, right? And particularly that this also happened during Ottoman rule as well, is where particularly the Sheikh al-Islam was appointed by the Sultan himself. And of course, the Sultan, you know, from a practical perspective, is not going to pick someone that's going to constantly oppose him.
yeah,
And someone that, if he does oppose him, what can he easily do? Fire him, right? And pick
yeah,
someone else in his stead, right? So when it comes to religion and scholarship, when it comes to scholarship and political leadership, there is a very fine line that we need to draw, because whilst once the ulama have the knowledge, unfortunately, it's the rulers that have to make the very, very tough decisions. Very, very
yeah,
tough decisions. And often those decisions might seem like it's going against the Sharia. And most of the time, unfortunately, it does go against the Sharia. Right? From that political leader's perspective, I'm doing what's best for my people. I'm doing what's
yeah,
best for my state. And again, drawing that fine line is a conversation that we're going to have to spend a very, very long time about. But really, really focusing on the aspect is that we have the difference between a leader that is a scholar and a leader that is accompanied by scholars. And this is what made the early Ottoman period a flourishing era. And I think this goes back to the question that you asked: what made the Ottomans special? Is that,
yeah,
as you mentioned before, the the sultans themselves were trained to be scholars. As
yes,
princes, as young men, they were taught the sciences. Muhammad al-Fatih himself knew 6 different languages. Not
subhanallah.
because he wanted to just know and curious about it, because he knew that he was going to rule over a multicultural empire. And instead of having translators talking to his own people, he fought the need to talk to his own people directly. And is that sentiment that died or that started to decline during the later Ottoman period, which contributed to, their fall in
Yeah,
the 1920s? It's this move away from Islamic scholarship. And whilst we had loads of, subhanAllah, many Ottoman scholars that made profound impacts to Islamic scholarship, right? The later Ottoman period didn't really facilitate that. A lot of the early Ottoman period did.
yeah,
And that is because the Ottoman sultans like Muhammad al-Fatih and his ancestors, the previous ones as well, really placed a big emphasis on that and on Islamic learning. And they also emphasize it in the local madaris, in the madrasas, because the school system and the educational systems had become a big part of the Ottoman Empire as well at the time.
yeah.
Mm.
Okay, mashallah, that's quite an interesting perspective, to be
Mm.
honest. On the topic of politics, so
Mm.
you did mention one thing that uh, sort of struck me
Mm.
with surprise. well, to be honest, it didn't really surprise me, but it was food for thought. You mentioned that this was one of the distinguishing features about the Ottoman Empire to perhaps any political system today, let alone any Islamic political system today. On the topic of distinguishing features and distinguishing traits, let's say we have the let's move away from the Khilafah al-Rashidun, because that's obviously untouchable. We have the Umayyad, we have the Abbasids, we have the Mamluks, we have the Ottomans, we have the Mongols. Let's go one by one. If you could
Yeah.
give us some distinguishing traits, some characteristics that stuck out in each of these Muslim empires.
Yeah. Well, if we start off with the Umayyads, inshallah, what was the brilliant thing about them is, of course, this is actually a point I want to clarify. Is something that's really, really important to clarify before I go into all the different states. Is that it's really, really important that we do not romanticize our history. Really,
Yeah,
really important. That as much as we love talking about our history and how I believe me personally, and I'm putting, this is my passion and my dedication in really pushing the Islamic history, the knowledge of Islamic history amongst our Muslim community
yeah,
is really important at the same time, not just to say all the good and leave all the bad, not to romanticize their history. But if we
yeah,
tell
yeah,
all the good
100%.
to our young people, and when they grow up and go in the same exact situation that I was in, and go to university, and then you have a university lecturer telling you, oh, the Muslims did this, the Muslims did this, the Muslims did that, immediately what that's going to make them question everything that they learn,
Yeah,
right?
100%, definitely.
So it's really important to also mention, the wrongs that Muslims have done, and that wasn't because of Islam; that was because of human error, and this came from Shaitan.
Yeah,
Right? And I think when we talk about the Umayyads, when we look at the later Umayyads, we have to understand that there were times, and when we look at people like, for example, like Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, a very controversial character,
yeah,
one of the Umayyad commanders, and what he did, for example, launching catapults to the Kaaba to deal with the rebellion of Abdullah ibn Zubair. We have to really question the
Radiallahu anhu.
motives, radiallahu
Yeah,
anhu, to question certain motives. But at the same time, we also look at the accomplishments in the fact that many of the Sahaba lived under the Umayyad Khilafah. Muawiyah himself was a Sahaba. He met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
yeah,
Um, and the rise of scholarship, for example, people like immense hadith scholars like Imam Shihab al-Wahri, rahimahullah,
rahimahullah, yeah,
and the rise of hadith scholarship, particularly in this period of time. And of
yeah,
course, one of the most important accomplishments is, for example, the taking over of Spain. The
yeah.
creation of Islamic Spain was done during Umayyad times. India as well. India
Oh,
as well.
really?
Yeah,
Inshallah.
India, especially, Muhammad al-Qasim was the
Oh,
nephew
yes, yes, yes. Yeah, yeah,
of
yeah.
Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, and he launched one of the first campaigns into the areas of Sindh, which is west northern India. And from there, and it's quite interesting because there are records of what Muhammad al-Qasim did in India, in which
Yeah,
in order to protect the people there, he established the Hindus and the Sikhs and no, not the Sikhs didn't exist at this
yeah,
time,
yeah,
but the Buddhists, sorry, as Ahl Dhimma, so people of people, by classifying them as people of the book, he could then grant them protection,
yeah,
which
yeah.
was quite an interesting point because then the Ummah could, the Umayyads could protect them, as in keep a standing army there in
Yeah,
India to look
as
after them.
dhimmis.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's these conquests that really made the Umayyads stood out. And then in about 150 years later, when the Abbasids come around, of course they create, this great city of Baghdad, the round city as they used to call
yeah.
it. And I'm pretty sure you've played Assassin's Creed Mirage.
Allah,
Yes. Yeah.
you've
Yeah.
first June now, Assassin's Creed. It's like I just get to talk about what I enjoyed today. Yeah, I've played it, and to be honest, one thing I noticed, you're in a game as a Khariji Shia assassin, but
Yeah.
even then you see the scholarship, the
Mm,
great library,
mm,
and every the scholars in the game they wear. I mean, I'm sure you can correct me, but I'm
mm.
sure this is representative of history. But they would
Yeah.
wear a separate robe, they would wear
Mm,
a separate turban,
mm.
and they're just there reading books all day. And you're just there, obviously, killing people and whatnot. But it's profound. But yeah,
Yeah.
you were mentioning on the
Yeah.
topic
Yeah.
of
And
Baghdad.
Baghdad was, I think that game really depicted Baghdad really, really well, as in the architecture, the people. It did really explain it pretty well. And again, it was one of the few cities, bear in mind, at this time that had, like, for example, running water, right? That had so many innovations at this time that when you go to Europe at this time, they they were, I want to be very crude here, doing their business in a hole in the ground,
Yeah,
right? So when you compare the European powers to the Islamic world at this time, there are large stark differences in technological advancement. Um, and in particular, that if you go to the Renaissance that Europe had in the 1500s, it was built upon what Baghdad did in the 800s. But
Yeah.
as Harun al-Rashid comes into power and the creation of the House of Wisdom, the Bayt al-Hikmah, you have a massive translation movement at this point in time, in which they are translating the works of Aristotle, Plato, much works that had been lost for such a long time. It was the Muslims that revived these sciences, that
Yeah, yeah.
revived.
And it's like how the philosopher
Mm,
of both the Muslim and
mm,
Orientalist world, they're all in agreement that so Islamic philosophy is the backbone
mm,
of Western philosophy. Even
mm.
you know, what's his name? Aquinas and these guys.
Yep.
It's all because of us. And
Yeah.
so and like you're mentioning, that comes from that culture that Baghdad had created, or that
Yeah.
the Khulafa had created in Baghdad.
Yeah, and it was a patronage of science that,
Yeah,
unfortunately, as well, also caused aspects or events like the Mihna to happen,
yeah, yeah.
where you had the Khalif Ma'mun persecuting scholars, particularly the most famous story being of Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah, and how he stood firm amongst the creeping of philosophy and
Yeah.
ration against faith and the words of the Prophet ﷺ and the words of the Quran, right? So you start having a building of that movement, but because again, the works of our scholars, the works of our ulama, which should never be depreciated, which never should be looked over. And we looked at
Yeah.
that at every point in our history, at every point that we are down, it has always been the ulama that were the first to really bring us back up and really be the forefront of revival.
Yeah.
And then what happens towards the end of the Abbasid period is that you have essentially a fragmentation of states. Unfortunately, by the time that Al-Ma'mun and his brothers Mutawakkil and Al-Wafiq, what starts happening is that the Abbasid Empire ends up fragmenting.
Yeah.
You start having independent kingdoms across the Islamic world, and of course, a state divided is obviously going to be a lot more worse than a state united. As
Of
Muslims,
course. Yeah.
unfortunately, and it's in this period of time that I love learning about this side of history, because whilst it was an incredibly sad part of our history, it's also one of the most pertinent ones in when we're comparing it to our situation today.
Yeah.
When we look at all these different states focusing on their own self-interest, Saudi Arabia focusing on their self-interest, Turkey focusing on their self-interest, we see this exact thing happening during the end of the Abbasid period,
Yeah.
where we have
And
states. Yeah, go on.
well, just give us a rough timeline. So from
Yeah,
this period at the end of the Abbasid
yeah,
period, when
yeah.
was the next time that Islam were sort of driving powerhouse? Well,
So at this point, then, so the part where it becomes really, Islam comes at the forefront again is again at the roots and the ashes of pure tragedy, and that it comes under the Crusades,
yeah.
the time of the Crusades.
And obviously this was one of the main topics you wanted to discuss today. So I'll let
Yeah,
you
and
take the rein here.
inshallah, yeah. So this is a really interesting topic, and I really believe that if there is one area of history that all Muslims should be very aware of and know the details about, it is the time of the Crusades, and particularly of one of the greatest figures in our Islamic history after the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and the Prophets,
Allah Rasul.
Salahuddin Ayyubi,
Yeah.
rahimahullah, right?
Rahmanullah.
And if we look at the history of the Crusades, so at this point in time in the year, let's go to the year 1000. The Abbasid world is fragmented. Everyone is divided. We have, unfortunately, Muslim kings, Muslim leaders, allying with non-Muslim leaders to fight against fellow Muslims.
Yeah.
We have this situation happening in Spain at this time. And comes the year 1099, and the Catholic Church at this point is becoming extremely powerful in Europe. But they have
Yes.
one goal. They have one goal, that whilst we have Europe under our grasp, we don't have the Byzantine, the Roman Empire under our grasp. Because who's ruling the Roman Empire at this time? It's a group called the Byzantines, which were
Yeah.
basically the successors to the old Roman Empire, right? And they were in the Middle East, and they neighbored very important Christian areas like what is modern day Egypt and Palestine, places
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Antioch, Jerusalem, of course, being the most important one.
Yeah. Bethlehem and these places as well.
Yeah, Bethlehem, of course, 100%. And comes the year 1099, and the first crusade is launched. In 1095, Pope Urban II, the Pope at this time, he initiates a decree. He makes a massive speech that was publicized everywhere, in a place called Clermont in France, pushing for the ordinary people of Europe, no matter who you are, that you are to go to Jerusalem and go fight for your land. And
Yeah.
that anyone that goes, no matter who you are, if you're a criminal or anyone like that, you are to go fight and as he described the Muslims as savages, as people that were possessed by demons. This is
Yeah.
what he explicitly mentioned in his speech, because we have records of his speeches.
Yeah.
Explain, really dehumanizing the Muslims in order to convince ordinary people like you and me to go fight and go kill someone thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
Comes 1099, and we see the tragedy, one of the greatest tragedies of our ummah, in which we have obviously the takeover of Jerusalem by the Christians. And if you read the reports of the actual primary sources that we still have today of the accounts of what happened in the First Crusade, what happened in 1099, Ibn al-Athir mentions that nearly 70,000 people were killed that day.
Subhanallah.
70,000 people killed. Many of them, and he mentions this explicitly, many of them the ulama. Why is it that the Christians targeted particularly the ulama? Again, this is a point to remember, because they knew that the ulama are the ones that revive. And we get rid of the ulama, we keep hold of this land. Right?
Yeah.
And if again, some of the reports mention, the Christian accounts, not the Muslim accounts, the Christians accounts mention that the blood reached the ankles of some of the men.
Subhanallah.
And there were cases, and subhanallah, I read this sometimes to recap sometimes, and it shocks me every time I read it, where they would get babies, newborn babies, and crushed, they literally banged them against the wall in front of their mothers.
Wow.
In front of
Subhanallah.
their mothers. And again, it's because of the dehumanization aspect, because the Pope was telling them, these are not people, these are animals, right? They deserve to die. And again, it's that dehumanization that still exists today when we speak about people, the people of Gaza, when we talk about the people of Syria, when we talk about the people of Sudan, is that unfortunately we see them as just figures. We see them as statistics.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that the First Crusade teaches us. And from the Crusades, we have remnants. For the first about 10, 15 years, there was very little going on about how do we revive this. And even then, like a couple of days after the Crusaders took over Jerusalem, you had Abu Sa'id al-Harawi, from the Grand Mufti of Damascus, running to Baghdad and going to the Khalif in Baghdad and saying, look at what you're doing. You are sitting in gardens of flowers and you have all this wealth, and you're doing nothing for your people in Palestine. But despite that, there wasn't much. But then soon after, you had people like, you had scholars coming about that really started building that revival spirit.
Yeah. Subhanallah. So that's a really, really emotional and interesting point you mentioned. And going back to a previous point you mentioned, with scholarship and the rulers being one and the same. Obviously, Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah, he's a student of Nuruddin Zengi. And Nuruddin Zengi and a good chunk of his army were all students of, the great Imam Abdul Qadir al Jailani, the great Sufi. And they were upon his tariqah and they would attend his lessons and they had given bay'ah to him. So it's quite profound, how deeply rooted religion is in such a brave moment of Islamic history where from the flames and from the ashes, the phoenix rises. So it's a really interesting point you mentioned.
Yeah, and another really interesting point is that we talk about Salahuddin a lot, right? We talk about Salahuddin, and rightly so, but we can't talk about Salahuddin without talking about Nuruddin, as you mentioned. For I sincerely believe there would not have been a Salahuddin if there was no Nuruddin.
Yeah.
But it was
What sort of role did Nuruddin play in the life of Salahuddin? Was it more of a mentor or sort of an inspiration?
Yeah. So this is the point that I really wanted to emphasize in understanding our modern discourse as well, is that going back to, I'll come back to the point of Nuruddin, is that you hear the saying today, we mentioned this a lot when we're talking about Palestine and other topics, is where is our Salahuddin today?
Yeah,
Where is
it's
our,
a very
yeah.
I mean, that's probably one of the most common cries that people have been echoing since October the 7th.
Yeah, where is our Salahuddin? Well, we ask the question then, okay, where is our Nuruddin?
Yeah.
Because I believe that in order to really create impactful leaders, you need three things. You need family, you need communities, and you need institutions. And what was really interesting about Salahuddin's upbringing is that he had all three that allowed him to flourish. What's quite interesting is that Nuruddin was his institution. Nuruddin Zengi was his institution, because Nuruddin was the leader of Syria. He had the structural integrity, the structural systems in place in order to teach Salahuddin about the art of leadership, and the importance of scholarship. And one of the first things that Nuruddin did when he became leader of Syria, quite interestingly, because he had plans to obviously retake Jerusalem from Muslims, one of the first things he did was that he made it compulsory for all the madaris in Syria, all the madrasas in Syria, to teach about the fada'il of Al-Quds,
Wow.
you know, the virtues of Al-Quds. That's one of the first things that Nuruddin did. Because how can you convince an ordinary person from Syria to go travel thousands of miles away to Palestine, not thousands of miles, but hundreds of miles away to Palestine, and risk your life for a city that you've never heard of?
Yeah.
That's what Nuruddin did. And that's the environment that Salahuddin grew up in. And then his father, Najmuddin Ayyub, taught him the art of politics. And then his uncle, Shirkuh, taught him the art of the military. And I think it's
SubhanAllah.
those
Yeah.
sort of institutions, and you know that his family helped him, you know, with the art of politics and military. The institution of Nuruddin really helped him there, and of course he had his community, the people that he was around, that understood the fada'il of al-Quds, that understood the virtue of al-Quds, that made them, you know, leave everything when Salahuddin called upon them in 1187.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
got a quick question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sir.
So, and this is more towards because I understand we're approaching the time of iftar as well.
Yeah.
From the impact of the Crusades and everything, what lessons from the Crusades do you think can be applied to modern challenges faced by the Muslim world?
Mm.
In your opinion, from everything that we've discussed and sort of gone over, what do you think would be more fitting for this?
It's in the short time that we have, I would definitely say the Crusades gives us hope. That when we're studying about this, the history of the Crusades, it definitely gives us hope. For the Muslims at this time really felt that there's nothing out there for us anymore, especially when the Mongols came, right? You know, there were scholars that were saying that the Ya'juj and Ma'juj had arrived. But then if you look at it from a certain perspective, from us looking back from hindsight, from our perspective,
Yeah.
the Crusades and the Mongol invasions were what could possibly, you could argue, was one of the best things that could have happened to this ummah, right? In the long term, of course, in the short term, it caused so much death and devastation, but in the long term, it again revived the spirit in building Islamic scholarship in places like India, and it built essentially the Ottoman state. And again, when we look at the story of the Crusades, it gives us a story of hope. And I think there's one particular story that I'll tell you guys that really, really, emphasizes on this aspect of hope. That when Salahuddin entered into Jerusalem, and they got to Masjid al-Aqsa, the ulama and Salahuddin and the people, they decided, okay, we should probably engrave an ayah into Masjid al-Aqsa.
Yeah.
We should engrave an ayah, and they deliberated what ayah should we put in, to commemorate, our retaking of Jerusalem and liberation of Jerusalem. And it's quite interesting what ayah they chose. They chose from Surah Taha, ayah, verse 21. Again, please correct me, Ustadh Munshi, if I get the ayah wrong.
أستاذ منشي.
But
أنا لست بأستاذ، هذا أنت. What was the verse then,
so
أستاذ؟
قال خذها ولا تخف. تخاف. Is it تخاف?
خف. Yeah.
تخاف. سنعيدها سيرتها الأولى. So this is in reference to
SubhanAllah.
the story of Musa alayhi salam, right? And him picking up the staff. Seize it and fear not. We'll return it to its former condition, i.e. the
Wow.
staff, right?
Yeah.
Now they put the ayah there to know and let the Muslims know that no matter what happens to Jerusalem, what happens to Masjid al-Aqsa, we will return it to its former condition. And I think that's a point that we need to remember as Muslims today, is that we do our best within our control. Every individual that might be listening to this, or every single one of us, we do what we can within our sphere of control.
Yeah.
The Crusades is a message of hope for us, that like Salahuddin took back Jerusalem, inshallah today and in the near future, Jerusalem, inshallah, سنعيدها سيرتها الأولى, will be returned to its former condition.
Inshallah, definitely. That's a very profound interpretation. I think one last point I'd like to add, which fits in quite nicely, is that obviously the Sunnah of Allah is strange, and it's something we can't comprehend. It's a divine wisdom which we can't really understand. And so in the year of in Amul Fil, when the Kaaba of Allah was attacked, and those who had an affiliation with the Kaaba were down, the Prophet ﷺ was born. When the Abbasid Khilafah fell at the hands of the Mongols in 656, this is when Uthman, who we mentioned earlier on, was born. And so perhaps from, inshallah, the hope, like you mentioned, خُذْهَا وَلَا تَخَفْ سَنُعِيدُهَا سِيرَتَهَا الْأُولَى. That throughout this, the one positive we have, throughout this dark sort of political era we're in, which is reminiscent of the late Abbasid era, like you mentioned, is that this is the time of hope.
Mm.
It's not the time where we'll flourish, but it's the time where we can, khalas, at least at the end of the tunnel there's a light.
Yeah.
So alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khairan so much, brother Nias.
Mm.
That was extremely, extremely insightful. I've done many radio episodes with Q-Iman, probably 10, 15. This was one of my favorite. In fact, this is probably my favorite. It was a profound discussion. We got to talk about your own credentials, the Ottomans, the Abbasids, all of these lovely topics. Alhamdulillah, 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 thumma alhamdulillah. May Allah bless you, and we'll see you around, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan. I'll
Yeah.
just I'll just commence with the short pre-iftar dua, and inshallah, Imam Abu Sarwar, would you like to do the adhan?
Inshallah, inshallah.
Inshallah, khair. ELM's iftar is at 6:02 today, so
Okay.
we'll at 6:02 just butt in and give the adhan, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan.
Inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. اللهم إنا نسألك بأننا نشهد أنك أنت الله لا إله إلا أنت الأحد الصمد الذي لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. اللهم صل وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وسلم تسليما. اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عنا يا كريم. يا خالق السماوات والأرض، ارجعنا إلى خلفائنا كخلفاء العثمانيين وخلفاء العباسيين وخلفاء العمويين. اللهم ارجعنا إلى رأس الأمور وإلى رأس العالم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم استخلفنا على هذا الأرض كما استخلفت العثمانيين والعباسيين وخلفاء الراشدين يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم زدنا بقوة كما ازددت قوة العثمانيين والعباسيين والعمويين ومن سلفهم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم زدنا بالإيمان وبالأمن يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم ارحم موتانا وموتى فلسطين وموتى الصين وموتى في كل مكان وفي كل بلد يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اشفنا. اللهم استيقظنا من هذا النوم الذي فيه نسينا قوة الإسلام ونسينا يعني أمن الإسلام يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم استيقظنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم بارك لنا وبارك علينا. اللهم بارك لنا وبارك في رؤسائنا. اللهم شدد أمورنا وشدد عذابك على أعدائنا يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى الله تعالى على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Just before the adhan, Jazakallah khairan for those who are watching, those who tuned in. And inshallah, we'll resume on Thursday. Jazakumullah khairan.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر
أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله